Welcome to my absolute beginner's guide to Kings of War. If you're an experienced wargamer or you've played Kings of War before, this guide probably isn't for you. In fact, you'll probably find it downright patronising. But if you're brand new to wargaming, miniature gaming or Kings of War, this guide is for you. I'll explain in 4 short digestible videos the absolutely basic rules and setup you need to play Mantic's Kings of War. This is video 3, the shooting phase. So it's your go. You've moved your forces and run to the next phase, which is the ranged phase. Now this video is a little bit longer because there's a bit more to cover, but hopefully we don't get too complex. So in this phase, you use any ranged attack your units have. They are marked on the unit profiles under the heading RA, and the weapon they're using is in the information underneath the unit profile.
What about magic spells?
Yes, so in Kings of War, magic is treated just like any other ranged attack. So if you've got a spell listed under a unit, like this one, this phase is when you use that spell. So we're going to start with normal ranged attacks, and we'll deal with a few examples of magic after that. Before we get onto how we shoot, there's a core concept I want to quickly cover, which is your unit facing. This gets more and more important as we get into combat, but it affects all aspects of the game. Imagine 45-degree angles from every corner of your unit. These are your unit facings. They are called the front, flanks, and rear of the unit. You can only see and interact with units that are in your front facing. Remember the arc templates that we covered in the first video? These are convenient ways to measure the 45-degree angle. With that knowledge settled in our heads, let's look at 2 core questions we ask when we want to shoot something. Can they see? And are they in range? Can they see assumes first that any part of your target is in your front arc, which if you remember, we just covered. Assuming they're in your front arc, you draw a line from what we call the leader point, the centre of the front of the unit. Assuming that line isn't blocked, you can see the unit.
What about if the line goes over some terrain or another unit?
Great question, and the answer depends on what the terrain is. Some terrain gives you what's called cover, and we're going to go over that shortly, so we'll stick with blocking terrain for now. So if in order to reach your target the line goes over blocking terrain, you can't see, hence you can't shoot. Okay, so we'll cover the mechanics of shooting first, and then we'll go over when a unit is in cover, which is where other terrain and units comes into play. The second check you do is whether they're in range. Under each ranged unit is what they shoot with and a measurement, so you can see these archers have a 24-inch range. Measuring from the leader point, you need to make sure your target is in range.
So this target is about 16 inches away, my range is 24 inches, so I can shoot?
Right. So now we'll show you how to work out what damage a unit. You need to take into account 2 statistics on your unit and 1 on your target. Here's some archer stats as an example. The RA range stat is what you need to roll on a dice to hit the unit. Your ATT, attack, is how many dice you roll. So this archer unit has an attack of 10, which is 10 dice, and needs a 5+ on any of those dice to hit. So our archer unit rolls 10 dice, and scores 3 hits because 3 of them are a 5 or higher. Now we need to know the defense of our target. We see here our target has a defense, a DE stat of 4+, so now we roll the dice that scored a hit, and any of those with a 4+ is a point of damage. Okay, so we've scored 1 damage, and our opponent marks that on the enemy unit. Okay, so let's talk about cover. Now the first thing you need to know about is height.
Are you going to tell Angel about how short I am?
Maybe. So height is an important concept. Each unit has a height stat. It's the bubble with HT in the corner. Base height is 1, and each value above that is supposed to be an inch. That means to see over something, you need to be taller than it. So a height 2 unit like these archers can't see over the height 3 horsemen in front of them.
Obviously.
Right. Fair point. But terrain also has a height. You can decide for yourself how high terrain is, but in general we play with hills around height 3, forests and such are taller than that, difficult terrain tends to be height 1 or flat, obstacles like walls offer cover but never block line of sight.
So if my unit is taller than the terrain, or is some obstacle, I can see over it?
Right, but if the difference in height is less than 3, the unit you're shooting at takes cover, which means you suffer a -1 to your to-hit roll. So in the example before of our archers who hit on a 5+, here because there's a wall in the way, they now hit on 6s, which is terrible. For a unit to get cover, at least 50% of the facing you're shooting at needs to be blocked, otherwise they don't take cover. Alternatively, more than 50% of its base can be in difficult terrain. In that case, they always get cover.
So if I shoot this unit, it doesn't take cover?
Right, because you're shooting the flank side and it's not covered 50%, so the height of the terrain doesn't matter. But if it was here, the big fire elemental is now sitting 100% in difficult terrain, in which case it doesn't matter how tall it is, it still gets cover. There are special cases with hills and difficult terrain, notably forests because they're so tall. If you're shorter than the terrain, you obviously can't see over or through them. If you're touching them with the leader point of your unit, you can.
Just the leader point?
Right, so if your corner is on this hill, you can't see over it, but importantly you can now be seen, so you need to be careful how you interact with terrain, because that means the enemy can see you.
That's kind of confusing though.
I agree. So the important thing to remember is that your leader point needs to be in the terrain to see over or through it.
So do they get cover if I can see through the forest or hill or wherever?
Yes, that's important. Okay, so remember we talked about how your leader point needs to be in the forest or touching a hill to see through or over it. If that happens and you haven't moved that turn, you can shoot through the terrain without cover.
What about if I just move into the forest?
So then you are affected by cover. It's similar for hills, except that if the entire unit is 50% or more on the terrain, you count as standing on the hill. You add the hill's height to your height and use that new value to calculate whether you're going to take cover or not. That isn't the case for difficult terrain, only hills, because you're considered to be in difficult terrain, not on it.
So if my unit isn't 50% on the hill, there is a cover penalty to my shooting?
Assuming your target's height isn't 3 or more higher than the hill, yes, but the benefit to you is that you also take cover from the hill if somebody shoots you back. It takes a bit of getting used to, but if in doubt, check the rulebook, as I'm not sure I'm explaining it terribly well here, and I think the book's descriptions are pretty clear.
Does anything else affect my to hit roll?
Yes, so there is a special rule which can affect it, which I'm going to cover later, but the most important one is movement. If your unit has moved, it's a -1 to your roll to hit, and that stacks with the cover penalty.
So if I move and shoot into cover, it's a -2 penalty?
That's right, -2.
But what if I already hit on 5+?
Right, so if your to hit goes above a 6 plus to hit, then you halve the number of dice you're throwing, and you still have to roll a 6+.
But that's terrible.
Well, yeah, 5+ shooting is bad for a reason. It's not much fun to just die to a hail of arrows before you get into combat, so there's lots of penalties to tone it down.
This game is dumb.
Now, at the end of the ranged phase, when we've shot everything, including spells, which we're going to do in a minute, we check to see whether we've killed any units. You don't check after each shot because you might want to shoot a number of times into a single unit, right? This is called the nerve check. Now, every unit has a nerve value marked here as NE. You'll see that most units have 2 numbers. So this one, for example, has a 15/17. The first one is called the waiver value, and the second one is called the route value. So, when a unit has taken damage in shooting, we're going to check their nerve. The person attacking rolls 2 dice and adds the total to the amount of damage on the unit. If it's higher than the route value, they're dead.
What about the waiver value?
Right, so if we're higher than the waiver but lower than the route value, your unit is wavered. That means they can't attack back, but they're not dead yet.
So what's the point of being wavered?
Well, you're not in a good place, so it only lasts for 1 turn, but in your movement phase when you're wavered, you can only turn on the spot or move backwards. You cannot fight or shoot. We're going to look at it more in the combat video. There is one thing I want to mention here, and that's inspiring. Inspiring is a special rule that some units or characters have. It's pretty important because if your unit is within 6 inches of a source of inspiring and it dies, your opponent has to re-roll that nerve check. You get a second chance.
Am I inspiring to you?
Yes, dear. Very inspiring. Also a rule. So, we'll quickly look at magic now, but we're not going to cover everything. All the spells are listed in the rulebook, and they all have different rules that apply to them. We'll look at a shooting type of magic, a beneficial type, and surge, which I mentioned very briefly in the movie video. So we'll use Fireball as an example, as it's one of the spells that does damage. Our Warlock here has the Fireball spell, which throws a ball of fire at your enemy. Each spell lists the effects that matter to it in the description. So we can see here that Fireball has a range of 12 inches, so you can chuck it at anything that's within 12 inches. The first thing to know is that all spells hit on a 4+ on a d6. The amount of dice you throw is indicated by the number in brackets after the spell name in your character description. They're also not affected by movement like other shooting, so that 4+ is pretty solid unless the spell description says otherwise. So our mage here throws 8 dice, and any that are a 4+ count as a hit.
How about cover?
So that depends on the spell. You see here on the spell description that Fireball hits on a 5+ if the unit is in cover, or has the stealthy special rule. In this case, our target is standing in a lake, and therefore takes cover, so we're hitting on a 5+, and then rolling to damage against the target's defense as normal.
So like any normal shooting attack?
Exactly. So our defense is 4, we've done no damage, so that means there's no need to roll a nerve check at the end of the turn. Heal's an example of a beneficial spell. You treat it like a shooting attack, so you need line of sight to the unit you're casting on, and it hits on a 4+ like all spells.
Does it matter if there's cover?
Nope. You see under the modifiers column there's nothing, so heal always hits on a 4+, and for each 4+ you roll, you remove a point of damage. Okay, so Surge. So there's a bunch of rules under Surge in the rulebook, but we'll just cover the basics because most of them are relevant to combat, and the Charge rule, which we'll cover in the next video. But the basic premise of Surge is that you can cast it onto any unit that has the Shambling rule, which we talked about in the last video about movement. You always need line of sight to cast your spell just like normal, but for every 4+ you roll, you must move that unit forwards by 1 inch.
What if you hit something?
Then you stop. If it's one of your units or a piece of impassable terrain, you stop and that's it. If you hit an enemy, you've charged them. This allows you to do clever things with your Shambling units, like hit units you wouldn't otherwise have been able to. We might do a video in future looking at tactics with Surge, but in the time being it's just important to know that units that are Shambling aren't quite as slow as you might think. So in the case of this unit of Wraiths, we're going to surge them forwards a few inches. So there are a few special rules that cover shooting. I'm not going to cover them all because most of them are self-explanatory, but I will cover a few important ones. They are Reload, Stealthy, Steady Aim, and Piercing. So Reload is a rule that applies to big, ungainly shooty things. If a unit has this rule, it can't move and shoot at the same time. You have to issue a halt order in order to shoot stuff with it. It mostly applies to things like big war engines, which have a few special rules themselves. We're not going to cover them here because this is a basic guide and I can't be bothered. The rulebook is pretty clear and you should probably check it out.
I'm not gonna do that.
Yeah, fair enough. So Stealthy is a special rule which affects how easy things are to shoot. It acts a little bit like cover in that if you have a stealthy unit, it's another -1 modifier to your to hit roll. Simple.
So basically, don't shoot stealthy stuff.
Pretty much.
Is there anything that makes shooting better?
I'm glad you asked. Steady Aim is a good example. If your unit has Steady Aim, it means they can move and shoot without taking the -1 movement penalty.
Yes!
And the last one we'll cover is Piercing. This is pretty rare, but good units and spells have Piercing as an ability, with a number after it, like this one. So in the case of this unit, when you roll to damage, you subtract 1 from the defense of your target. So if you're shooting a unit with 5+ defense, you only need a 4+ damage roll to hurt them.
I'm making an army with lots of them in it.
That is definitely a strategy.
Okay, that's the rules for the ranged phase. I know it's a bit confusing to start with, particularly when you're working out, what's cover, what's not. But after a few games, it does get clearer and clearer. The good news is that cover is probably one of the most difficult things to get used to. It's not that complicated. Everything else is pretty easy. So in the next video, we're going to deal with what I think is the most fun phase of the game, melee phase. So until next time, may the best general win.